Welcome, Bitrise Mobile DevOps 2022 attendees. I'm Jeffrey Lau. I work at Khan Academy. This is my talk from Backend DevOps to Mobile DevOps, and I hope you enjoy the talk. So, Khan Academy is a nonprofit organization that offers free educational content in math, science, and humanities in multiple languages, as well as tools for parents, teachers, and districts to track student progress. We have over 135 million people learning with us today. We are in 190 countries, and our educational content is translated by the help of volunteers in over 50 plus languages. We had over 8 billion learning minutes in 2021. We offer a website written in React, as well as a mobile app on iOS and Android written in React Native. Now, this quote is from a company called Runway, it's blog, and I thought it rang true to what Khan Academy is, since we're a small company and we are trying to make this big mission of providing accessible education to anyone, anywhere around the world. And in regards to mobile, well, mobile infrastructure at smaller companies is usually a shared responsibility. Instead of having a dedicated person or persons owning project infrastructure related chores, those tasks are considered to be everyone's responsibility, and they are normally assigned to whoever has bandwidth or is experiencing a given pain point the most. Now, who am I? I primarily worked in backend over my entire career until I got to Khan Academy. I did API, DevOps, cloud infrastructure, from enterprises to startups, and in a whole bunch of different sectors such as fintech, online dating, retail, and now edtech. So with regards to that quote we just saw in the last slide, I was hired on to really fill that role of what was a shared responsibility to be kind of the owner of it and take responsibility of maintaining and developing the infrastructure for mobile, while the mobile engineers can now refocus on completely product work, since a lot of them do both web and mobile because our stack is written with JavaScript. So my first task was to look at our current tools and systems and develop a roadmap to get our infrastructure to a place where my manager said builds are running fine, releases are smooth, and shipping quality apps. So our tools that we use at Khan Academy in regards to mobile is Sentry for crash and error logs, CI/CD with Bitrise, iOS Fastlane, Android Gradle. Testing, we use Sauce Labs device farms, and then we run Appium tests on it. We use BigQuery for our analytics, and deployment, similar to everyone, is Apple and Google. And our development is in JavaScript, and we use flow types with React Native. Now that I was able to see the lay of the land, I wanted to dive deeper into Bitrise, and my manager told me that some of the key issues that they had were the builds were inconsistent, the builds were taking a long time, the code was kind of not in the best shape and needed a lot of love. So I went in and just dived head first to see what I can do to improve how we use Bitrise, leverage some of the features that it has to really speed up things and make it clean, maintainable, and easy to understand. Infrastructure as code is managing and provisioning of infrastructure through code instead of through manual processes. With Bitrise, they do exactly that. So in Bitrise, if you go into the UI, they have a workflow editor for creating workflows, defining steps, and with each of those widgets that you use, Bitrise behind the scenes is constructing this YAML file that you can see right here. And so infrastructure as code. IAC is the managing and provisioning of infrastructure through code instead of through manual processes. Bitrise actually does this, even though in the UI, you can use the workflow editor and define the workflows and steps you want in your build processes all through it within the UI. But behind the scenes, they record it and store it into this YAML file that you can either store on bitrise.io or you could store in your own app repository. For us, we use GitHub for source control, and there are limitations to storing on Bitrise, the YAML file, which is no tracking of who and what and where changes were made to the YAML, no versioning to allow rolling back to a known YAML version that's good, no guardrails in place for changes made in Bitrise to enforce quality. Whereas if we store in the app repository, we can use GitHub checks for saying, for example, a guardrail that we want is to have at least 2 approvers before we merge the changes to our YAML file. GitHub stores the versions, you can tag them, and also you can use git blame to see who and what changes were made to the YAML file, which is all very, very good for us in maintaining our YAMLs for Bitrise. However, the one thing I don't like about the Bitrise YAML storage on the app repository is there's no feature to define where your app's YAML file is. For example, we have a React Native application and we store all the code in one mono repo. There's an iOS folder and an Android folder. I would have loved to say that for our Android app, our YAML file is under the Android folder versus our iOS YAML file is under our iOS folder. Instead, what Bitrise does is it takes the YAML file and assumes that it's at the top level of the repository and there's only one. So this didn't really work with our model. However, we were able to finagle the YAML file, combine the iOS and Android workflows into one so that both our apps can use the same YAML file. The only issue is now the Android workflows are in our iOS app and our iOS workflows are in our Android app. So it leads to a lot of confusion because when you say, I want to trigger a workflow, you're allowed to trigger the Android workflow in your iOS app, even though it might not be configured to do that way. So that was my biggest gripe about that. Now, logging in to Bitrise at first, I saw this. Very messy apps with very confusing names, and you don't know which one has our production builds, which one's a place where I could test things, deprecated stuff, so this hasn't been touched in a while. And then the permissions were very open for all our users to be able to create apps and name them however they want without any structure or convention. So a really easy win was just to construct it into this format, which is we have prod and dev, and we deleted all the unused apps by working with the other teams to see like, hey, is anyone using this? And then limiting the permissions of users to keep a clean environment so that only certain people like myself can create apps. Now, the next thing I did was parameterize workflows. Our Bitrise information about our builds was stored in a Google Sheet, and I was very surprised because we could actually put this description in here inside the YAML file itself so that it self-documents along with the code. I also saw something very odd, which is all these workflows, all 4 of them, look very similar. And even in the description, it says this is a clone of the above jobs. But however, there's like a slight modification where we don't send the report to Slack or we don't run a certain test. And in my mind, I thought, wow, we're copy and pasting code, duplicating stuff. And it seems to me, instead of having one workflow and one sort of like common source of truth, we have multiple. And this is bad because now let's say I make a change to the workflow 3, but I don't sync it up with the other workflows. And now we're out of sync, which is pretty bad. So in my head, I thought, well, let's have one and then parameterize. So how can you do that in Bitrise? Well, Bitrise, you can have environment variables that are passed when you execute a build. For example, in here, I pass in an environment variable called isDebug, and I say it's a Boolean that's true. And then what Bitrise does is it passes it to the build environment, and now that environment variable is there so that you can do conditional logic, like, oh, if don't report to Slack is true, then don't execute the Slack step. So we reduce the code from 4 workflows to just one workflow. And now all the common code is in one workflow, and we don't have to worry about the syncing issue. Now, extracting scripts. Well, a good portion of our scripts that are used for our builds on Bitrise can be reused on different CI platforms such as GitHub Actions. And this will allow us to, if we decide Bitrise isn't the platform we want to use, extract our business logic scripts and easily import them over to another CI platform. Unfortunately, when I looked at it, our scripts were baked into the Bitrise YAML and were very, very hard to read. So I had to extract them into another file, format them, make it clean, and then source control them. And also, I version locked the step. So you can see here the script step, there's no version defined. So if the script step releases a new version that's breaking for our current existing builds, Bitrise will pull that latest version, and then we would break our builds and we would have to modify the changes to whatever that new version has defined as like a breaking change. Instead of like locking it, making sure that we consciously update the steps, similar to like libraries in the backend. And then also I did some cleanup of deprecating scripts and workflows that were not used, which was a lot of them. So another thing that I did was, I know actually a key thing that we want to do was just one workflow for our builds, both nightly and our ad hoc builds. So we are on a legacy Bitrise plan where our builds will time out after 90 minutes. So you might say to yourself, well, why don't you just upgrade to the newest versions where they charge by the build time? Well, we did the math, and the money we save is very attractive, so we're okay with working this limitation. Therefore, we separated this one workflow, which took about, like, for iOS, 219 minutes and Android 99 minutes, way past our 90-minute mark. And so if we were to run it in one workflow, it would time out. We separated it into 3 steps defined right here, and each of them have a certain amount of time. And then in this last column, I said, oh, okay, let's say we try to get it to run under 80 minutes to give us a buffer. Well, let's how much time do we have to save in order to get to that goal? Another annoying inconvenience of these 3 steps that need to be run sequentially instead of just one master one, was our developers who needed to create ad hoc builds for QA to test had to manually trigger the first one, then check back, then trigger the second one, then check back, and then trigger the third one to make sure everything is good to go for QE to test, which was very cumbersome. Now, how can we speed up the builds? Well, we can parallelize. So Bitrise has a really, really good feature of allowing you to run parallel builds. And what we did was look at where can we parallelize. In this example, in our iOS build, we have to build a .zip and .ipa file in order to run a test in Sauce Labs. The .zip is for the simulators, and then the .ipa is for the physical devices on Sauce Labs. The build workflow originally took over an hour running the 2 builds one after the other, but we said, hey, they don't need to be run sequentially after each other. They're not dependent on each other. So let's build them in parallel. And in doing so, we saved over 25 minutes. On top of that, with the builds, we also leveraged Bitrise's other feature of build caches and using that so that when we build our artifacts, they don't have to download the dependencies every time. We could just load it from cache if nothing has changed, like the version has not changed. Now, another thing for speeding up the builds was actually speeding up the tests. But in order to speed up the tests, we got to make sure the tests are stable. So the tests were failing a lot. and they were considered very flaky, to the point where developers didn't even pay attention to if they were failing or not in nightly. So you can see here, it's a little small, but in here we're searching for a component named early math, and there's actually a rename to early math review. So the failure was introduced at this time, and it went 6 whole days before we implemented a fix, which was just a one-liner. So if the smoke tests were reliable, instead of saying, "Oh, hey, it was just flaky," we'll just wait for the next day for it to be fixed. That what caused us to let a bug slip by for 6 whole days, and we just need to be more on top of things and build the trust again with our developers, with our tests. So how can we stabilize our tests? Well, we have to analyze which ones fail consistently. And in Sauce Lab, you can see actually the failure rate. So we actually had some tests failing 100% of the time in the last 30 days. So I did some research on this, and then I did some basic statistics of like, oh, okay, if this test fails about, let's say, 30% of the time, how many times would it fail if in a month if we had at least 2 retries, right? And then we will see how many tests are left after commenting out or removing the number of tests that fail, for example, 20% of the time. The right amount of coverage to the amount of times that the test would fail, I found was a good 20% failure rate with at least 5 retries. And this would result with a test failing within a month to be less than 1%. And it has been showing very, very good results so far where the developers really trust the test. And I'm on top of when our nightly builds fail because of these tests. And usually it's because there is an actual change now, which is very, very good. Now, an added bonus to stabilizing our test was it actually sped up our test. So we killed 2 birds with 1 stone. And we can see here that by commenting out, removing those tests, we increased our speed by 40%. And the 2 reasons were, of course, less tests to execute, but also the less number of retries, because we had some tests that would constantly fail and we would constantly retry. But if you can see in the screenshot, running 1 test as a retry resulted in 84 seconds on Sauce Labs to execute. And this is because Sauce Lab cold boots for every test run the device instead of reusing a hot one that they used in a previous test, which is something I really don't like about Sauce Labs. Otherwise, that could be another opportunity for speeding up our tests running on Sauce Labs. And then another thing we could have done, but was limited by our current pricing plan with Bitrise, is upgrading to bigger instances so that we have more compute power and it will speed up the builds. Now, lessons learned from being in the back end to going to the front end and then overhauling our Bitrise, and kind of like what I've learned so far being here at Khan Academy for 5 to 6 months in my role, that mobile releases are not immediately available. It's a release train that we go on, a release process, the approval process of Apple and Google, and not all users will upgrade to your newest version. So you have a bunch of different clients out in the wild. Unless you do a force update, you have to have a minimum version that you support. Instead of a backend where, oh, hey, I have all my servers and I control them. Let me just deploy the newest code right now on all of them. Or, hey, I'll deploy this code into our backend, and if it breaks, I'll just roll it back immediately to the previous version. So everything in the backend is very quick, and it's not as scrutinized as mobile releases because you kind of have like a one-shot go, and you can't really immediately roll back. So the impact of releasing a bug is much, much larger than if you're in the backend. On top of that, monitoring and alerting is more challenging in mobile because now you have to really understand your errors, because a lot of them are actually user errors that I saw where the user runs out of disk space, so some of our features don't work, or the user usually has like a network issue. So we see some errors coming in from that. And on top of that, monitoring and learning is like their clients, right? So you have to instrument your application to be able to emit those metrics to your servers in order for you to understand what's really going on with the clients and their apps. And then another lesson was when mobile teams start getting bigger, there is a bigger need for someone responsible for the infrastructure before things get out of hand. So you saw from our case study of overhauling Bitrise at Khan Academy that when it was shared, it was kind of like the wild, wild west. There was no good standards, no one taking responsibility for implementing guardrails or approving things. It was just each engineer was just doing what they felt was best, and it was very, very inconsistent, and you could see that. Also, it's important to test on real devices and have a wide coverage of the devices that match your user base because, for example, I recently upgraded our app to Android 12 to be compatible, and on the simulator, worked totally fine. When I actually tested on the real device, it started crashing. And in that, we found out that we needed to upgrade our React Native library. So if I only did simulation tests, that bug would have went to production, and we wouldn't have figured it. We would have like shipped a crashing app to our users. Now, another thing is the transition for backend to front end was not as big of a learning curve thanks to the support of my team, and it's not as scary dipping your toes into the other side of into the front end of the world. So it's been a really good learning opportunity and good experience. Now, where does Khan Academy want to go with the mobile DevOps? Well, our goal is to have 5 million students improve 50% in math or science by 2027. This will mean shipping as little bugs as possible and resolving them as soon as possible. And that comes from us being on top of our monitoring and learning, and as well as our testing, so that make sure that our users are not getting any bugs so that it does not interrupt them from learning. Currently, we are working on building out our infrastructure in GCP to automate and streamline our release process to allow the release engineer to have an easier, smoother time, less time consuming. So because we want to in the future do more frequent updates so that our users have the latest and greatest and be able to resolve bugs really quickly. So we're evaluating whether we want to do like over the air updates in the future. And with that, I just want to say thank you and have a good rest of the conference. If you have any questions, feel free to message me and I'll be more than happy to answer. Thank you.